So I just did a no-death run of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Now let's talk about Dark Souls 2.
Just a robot.
In my first Q&A on my old channel, someone asked me what was my favorite game, and I said it was Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin.
You play any games, Mr. Robot? If so, what's your favorite? Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin is definitely my favorite game.
Needless to say, this turned a few heads, and a lot of people wanted to know why I thought Dark Souls 2, out of all of the Souls games, was my favorite in the series. I will admit, it's a very unpopular opinion. Some people think it's a straight-up bad game, others say it's a good game, but not a good Souls game. Some people say it is a good Souls game, but not a very good one. But very few people would say it's their favorite in the series. Now, two of the reasons why I like it so much are purely circumstantial, and pretty much only applies to me. One of the reasons why I like it so much is because it was the second Souls game I played, right after Dark Souls 1. I did absolutely love Dark Souls 1, but I was still getting used to the mechanics. Yeah, I did about a dozen new playthroughs of it and I got the mechanics down, but because I played it through so many times, there was nothing new to surprise me. Dark Souls 2 was a new adventure, but this time I knew what I was doing. Despite the game being about twice as long, I got through it much faster. So yeah, if I didn't play Dark Souls 1 first, I wouldn't have liked Dark Souls 2 as much. Which is pretty much the opposite for everybody else who played Dark Souls 1 then played Dark Souls 2. As for the other circumstantial reason why I like it, well, I'll talk about that at the end of the video. But now let's talk about the more objective reasons why I like this game. 1. You can teleport from bonfires at the beginning of the game. Oh my god, I love this so much. In Dark Souls 1, you didn't get this ability until after you fought Ornstein and Smaug, which is about halfway through the game. And no, you don't carry over this ability into New Game Plus. You have to play through the game halfway every time to get this teleportation ability. Not starting off with this ability only pads out the game, especially after you fight Quelaag. You have to walk all the way back through the poison swamp. Granted, this is more a complaint about Dark Souls 1 than something Dark Souls 2 did right. After all, you also start off with this ability in Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro. And just like in Dark Souls 3, you can't level up at the bonfire anymore. You have to go to the Firekeeper to level up. And for how long the load times last, it really pads out the game. At least in Sekiro, you could not only teleport to bonfires at the start of the game, but you could also level up at the bonfires, making Sekiro the best of both worlds. But hey, I would still rather wait through load times to level up than trudging through the poison swamp after fighting Quelaag. Dark Souls 2 also easily has the best replay value out of all of the Souls games. Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 New Game Plus just make the enemies tougher. Dark Souls 2 New Game Plus right out of the gate hits you with 3 enemies. And they use falcons to attack you, which is something completely new to the Souls series. And you only fight these guys after New Game Plus, unless you play the Scholar of the First Sin edition. But New Game Plus also adds a few red phantoms, and for how long the game is, after you play through it, it still feels relatively fresh the next time around. There's also a few little details to Dark Souls 2 that really add to New Game Plus, like the Pursuer Knight. You can fight him in the game way earlier than when you're supposed to, but you only get one shot at it. And on top of all of that, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin Edition adds a lot of tougher enemies early on in the game, changes different enemy placements, and even allows you to rematch certain bosses at different locations, giving it even more replay value on top of the replay value it already had. Honestly, I kind of wish From Software would do this more often. You also have the ability to reset areas in Dark Souls 2 using special items at the bonfires. In a lot of the Souls games and in Sekiro, there are a lot of bosses that I would like to fight again without having to do a whole new playthrough. But in Dark Souls 2, you can reset areas at bonfires to rematch a boss you have already defeated instead of playing through a whole new playthrough. Now I know some of you are thinking, Well, yeah, it would be fun to do that in a game like Sekiro, Dark Souls 1, or Dark Souls 3. But why would you need to do that in Dark Souls 2? All the bosses are terrible! While I will admit that Dark Souls 2 has a lot more quantity than quality of bosses, I would argue that quantity is a quality all of its own. Yeah, a lot of the bosses are just a humanoid figure in armor, but come on. 90% of the bosses in Sekiro were just a human with a sword, not even in armor. But it still gets a free pass just because it has faster gameplay. It just makes me wonder that if Dark Souls 2 had faster gameplay like Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne, would it have gotten a free pass for its bosses? I thought it was interesting to fight Ornstein by himself. Yeah, the Dragon Rider boss wasn't really that great, but later you fight two at the same time, and it made me realize that the first fight was just getting me ready for this one. But yeah, a lot of the bosses are terrible, especially the ones that are just a large group of enemies. And Dark Lurker, one of the best bosses in the entire series, is extremely hidden, and you're probably not going to fight him unless you look up how to do so. Which is just bad design. Don't hide the best parts of your game. But despite most of the bosses in the base game not being very good, the Dark Souls 2 DLCs add a ton of great new bosses. Dark Souls 1 had one DLC, Dark Souls 3 had 2 DLCs, but Dark Souls 2 had 3 DLCs, which is just as many as the other two combined. And the DLCs in Dark Souls 2 are just as good as the DLCs from the other Souls games. It's so fun using a bow to activate different puzzles. It really felt like I was playing Legend of Zelda. The new enemies they added were great, and the Dark Witch, who was the second to last boss, would have made a great final boss. But they go above and beyond and add a poison dragon afterwards. And it's arguably the best dragon boss fight in the series. It's certainly a lot better than the giant dragon boss fight or the Red Dragon on the Bridge. The final boss of the Rune Tower DLC is the toughest boss in the entire Souls series. And if you're wearing a certain helmet while fighting him, like I did, he's even tougher. And I like how the Ivory King DLC can affect the base game. In the base game, there's a foggy forest full of invisible enemies. When you gain the ability to see the invisible tiger in the Ivory King DLC, you can also now see the invisible enemies in the foggy forest. But after playing through the DLCs, it finally revealed to me what people really don't like about Dark Souls 2. In the first Dark Souls 2 DLC, there's a hidden area with horrible level design, and the boss is just 3 really tough humanoid enemies. In the second DLC, there's a rematch with the Smelter Demon. Granted, he's slightly different, he gives off magic flames instead of fire flames, and he has about 1 or 2 more attacks. Oh god, the Frigid Waste. And all it leads to is a boss where instead of fighting 1 giant tiger, you fight 2 giant tigers. You see, when a video game, movie, or pretty much any form of media is being developed, even a YouTube video, a lot of the things the developers were originally going to put in get cut out. Sometimes it happens due to time restraints, budgeting reasons, and sometimes things get cut because they're terrible. Dark Souls 2 is already by far the longest game in the series, most likely longer than Dark Souls 1 and 3 combined. It really wouldn't have lost all that much if they cut just a few things out. And they even hide the terrible part in the DLCs. I have no idea why they put them in if they're going to hide them. But since they're optional, who really cares? If you're someone who wants to play Dark Souls stuff purely for being more Dark Souls stuff, then play these parts of the DLCs. And if you're someone who doesn't want to play them, just don't. The game is already long enough as it is. A lot of people also complain about the amount of ganking in Dark Souls 2. The game just throws a bunch of enemies at you all at once. And while I will admit it was a problem for me at first, it did teach me not to use the lock-on button so much, and to use giant swords and area effect magic more often. Bloodborne teaches you not to use the shield so much and dodge more often, and Sekiro teaches you how to deflect. Every From Software game teaches me something new about their gameplay. As I said at the start of the video, there's one more subjective reason as to why I like Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin so much. Well, I already played through Dark Souls 2, and then a couple months later I went through a pretty bad time in my life. In fact, it was probably the worst time of my life. I don't want to go into it right now, but playing Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, which was something different yet familiar, really made me feel a lot better. I'm not saying this makes Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin the best game in the series. I'm just saying it makes it my favorite. Well, at least I thought this experience was unique to me. But after looking it up on YouTube, I found that a few people did videos on Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, and how it helped them with their depression, suicidal thoughts, and other things. That's because the Dark Souls series, when you really get down to it, is kind of an allegory for depression. When you're depressed, you don't want to do anything. You just want to give up on life and lay in your bed all day. Or maybe you just want to give up on life altogether and just end it. In real life, challenges are thrown at you that you just don't think you'll ever be able to overcome. Whether it be school, socializing with others, or just finding your place in the world. And in the Dark Souls series, you fight bosses that just seem impossible to defeat. But if you keep trying over and over, eventually you'll be able to overcome them. And once you finally do, you feel a great sense of accomplishment. And you feel that because you overcome these tough bosses, you'll be able to overcome your problems in real life. I thought Dark Souls 1 was a masterpiece of a game, and I really liked it. But I played Dark Souls 2 when I really needed to. I thought my experience was unique to me. I thought this experience was unique to me, but turns out a lot of other people sharing this same experience I do. Also, I want to make it clear I don't have a capture card, so I had to use gameplay from other videos, but I am going to give credit. Links to the gameplay I used in this video in the description down below. Sorry if this video wasn't the best. I've never done a video game review before, and I'm not very good at talking positively about things. I'm more used to tearing them apart. And I'm sorry about my last video, my editor went a little above and beyond with how much he was making my character bounce. Ever since I got a new job and moved into a new apartment, I don't edit my videos myself anymore. So this is not only new grounds for me, but new grounds for my editors as well. I know it's a bit of a rocky adjustment, but don't worry, things will be back to normal eventually.
My eyes have seen the glory of the cleansing of YouTube, debunking SJWs and feminazis too. We criticize reactionists in hopes they get the boot. Just a robot marches on.